Before we finally embark on a detailed look at the English language, it really wouldn't do to ignore something quite important. So far we've looked at language in terms of what it is we know when we know a language, as though it's some kind of abstract knowledge system, which in some ways it is. And we haven't looked at all at what we do with it. In a way, that's like saying, here's a hammer. Let's have a good look at this hammer. Well, it's got a head, and the head has a claw for pulling nails out at one end, and at the other end it's got a sort of roundy, fat bit for banging nails in, and it's got a handle, and the handle might be wooden and so forth. What do we do with it? Well, we're not interested in that. Well, language has similar properties. We can look at it in terms of what it looks like and how it works internally without really looking at its use. But of course we have languages in order to use them, so we're going to briefly look at that. It's really quite another area, but it's worth us having a look at. So let's ask, what do people do when they use a language as opposed to what do people know when they know a language? The first thing that has been pointed out repeatedly in the last 50 years, particularly by one of the greatest linguists of the 20th century, Noam Chomsky, is that when we use a language, we're being creative. We use the system that we have in our brains, and we use it in novel ways all the time. Is that really true? Well, let's have a look. Here's a little exercise, one of the exercises that we do from time to time. Spend a minute or two to make a couple of sentences you've never ever said before, and then maybe write them down. Think of a sentence that you've never said before. Here's a sentence I've never said before. Hammering hairpins in with a hammer on a pincushion is going to get you into trouble. I've never said that before. I really haven't said that before. Was it difficult? Was it difficult for you to make up a sentence or two that you've never said before? No, it's not difficult at all. Easiest thing in the world. Maybe most of the sentences that we produce, maybe the sentences that I'm producing, that Noam Chomsky produces, haven't ever been said before. Not quite in the way that we say them. And it's not difficult at all. We don't suddenly feel terribly tired after producing a sentence we haven't said before. Did we feel terribly creative? No, we didn't feel creative at all. We're not sort of poets or playwrights. We're not involved in creative activity. Well, yes, we are, in fact. We were being creative. When you produce a new sentence, a lot of the time you are producing a sentence that hasn't been produced before. So, of course, producing sentences is creative in some very obvious but not readily recognizable way. You were being creative. Well, that's true. On the other hand, that creativity that we have when we use language is not unconstrained. There are a lot of things that we could say that we don't say, and there are very good reasons for that. When we're talking, our talk is being constrained all the time by a great many factors. Our pronunciation, for example, is being restricted in some way. Our vocabulary is not always fully in evidence. There might be words that we know that we're not using. We might be able to produce sentences with a grammar that we haven't produced before, but we mightn't actually produce at all. So let's have a wee look at some sentences and pieces of text that are real, if you like. They have been produced, and see what kinds of factors are involved in restricting the creativity we have. I'm not saying that we're not being creative. I'm trying to suggest that there are factors that restrict this creativity in particular ways. Here's one. What's going on here? Well, it's obviously an American speaking, that's obvious from the beginning, and probably it's a very important American. It might be the President of the United States. Where is he speaking? Well, it might be that he's speaking on radio or television. He probably isn't talking to a group of friends at a dinner table. That would be weird, wouldn't it? It's also quite clear that he's speaking. He's not writing. So, what's this person doing? Well, this text is almost certainly written rather than spoken. It looks like something from a geography book, or maybe a travel brochure. It's certainly not part of a political speech, and it probably isn't the President of the United States. In fact, the author is rather more anonymous than the speaker in the previous section. Here's another one. Well, we know what this is. If you've been to a baseball or softball game and listened to a radio commentary, this is the sort of thing that you get in a radio commentary. It's not something that the person next to you says. It's something that is specialized particularly to a commentator. Commentators do this sort of thing. And maybe it's on radio, maybe it's on television, but it's spoken, it's not written down, and it's the sort of talk that is called sports announcer talk by Charles Ferguson. Again, you couldn't just say this anywhere. Imagine meeting a terribly important person at a dinner party and coming up to them and saying, "Johnson waits for the pitch, here it comes, swung at and missed." You'd probably end up in a psychiatric institution. What about this one? Well, this is almost certainly a news report. It looks as though it's a scripted report being read either on radio or television. It doesn't feel like a newspaper report. It feels more like a piece of scripted news reporting. So there's something specialized, something that feels as though it's a news report rather than, say, a written report. And this is a chunk from the Bible. We don't talk like this anymore, and it was certainly written, and it's written to be read, not scripted. It's not part of a play, it's not part of a poem, it's part of the Bible. Well, this could be someone talking to a dog or to a small child, and we know something about where they come from because they use the word grandpappy. That's not a word that's used in every part of the English-speaking world. So it looks as though it's spoken, and it looks as though it's spoken from one person to another rather than in a public speech, and it looks as though it comes from a particular location. What about this one? Well, for those of you who have experienced visits by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, this is the sort of thing she used to say when she visited other countries. And the phrase "my husband and I" tended to be used a lot in the early days of her reign when she visited countries. So it looks as though we can't just say anything we like, but that language use is constrained. What are the factors? Well, your own personal idiosyncrasies will constrain what you say, what you write. Everybody has their own little quirks, their own little tics by which they can be recognized. One of the most obvious is your own tone of voice. If you have a friend ring you up on the telephone without the friend telling you who they are, within 2 or 3 words you know who they are because you recognize their voice. But they also speak a dialect. In the case of English, I'm speaking New Zealand English, and some of you who are listening speak quite other dialects, and if you listen to me long enough, you'll recognize a New Zealand dialect speaker, at least to some extent. If I was an Australian, I might sound a little bit different. I would certainly sound different if I was from the Ozarks. Those dialects can be regional, of course, and those are the ones we recognize, but they can also be social. You can quite often recognize that a particular person who is speaking comes from higher or lower down the social scale, and we know that every text comes from a particular time period. Shakespeare's English is different from ours. The biblical text that we looked at a little while ago was written a long time ago. It feels archaic. The purpose for which a text is produced, written or oral text, has an effect. If you're giving a public speech to the whole of the American people on television, you're going to sound different from someone who is speaking at a dinner party or someone who is chatting on the telephone. The purpose for which we use language constrains the way we use the language. The particular mode we choose to occupy, dialogue, monologue, those have an effect. Whether we're reading, whether we're writing, those have an effect. The medium we use, whether it's television or radio or whether we're speaking over the telephone, all of those have an effect. We're very sensitive to our audience. All of us accommodate to some extent to the audience that we're trying to produce our speech for. And there's even evidence that we deliberately change our language to fit in with the language of those that we are trying to talk to or write for. Obviously, our relationship to our audience has an effect. If you're speaking to one person or to 100, it makes a difference. At the moment, I'm in this strange position of speaking to you. I don't know who you are. Many people are going to listen to these little movies, maybe in different parts of the world, but we have a relationship, and it's a relationship to do with the fact that we're interested in the English language and trying to discuss it in a particular way. But I'm producing a monologue. You can't speak back to me on these movies, more's the pity. Occupation has an effect. We saw that in one of the earlier movies. Whether you're an auctioneer or a lawyer or a doctor has an effect. If we look at lawyers in particular, when a lawyer is cross-examining, the lawyer sounds quite different from when he's talking to a client in the office. When a barrister is summarizing, she might say something quite different from what she says beforehand talking to a colleague. So there are numerous factors, all of which somehow constrain the creativity that we have when we're producing text, when we're using the language. So language has this kind of interesting dual character. On the one hand, when we use it, we are free and unconstrained. We can be creative in a great many ways. On the other hand, there are a great many factors that limit that creativity, and of course it'll be obvious to you from this list that these factors are social. Because we belong to the social order, all of us exist as social beings. We don't just do whatever we like. We're constrained by the world we live in, the social world we live in, to doing things in particular ways.